becoming valuable and fallible for the scapegoat survivor of narcissistic parents. Did you live in fear that your next mistake would lead to your parents' outrage, punishment, and derision? Do your imperfections seem to cancel out your strengths? Is it extremely hard to give yourself credit? The scapegoat child grows to believe that their fallibility cancels out their strengths. In contrast, their narcissistic parent's fallibility does not. The parent gets to consciously see themselves as perfect and deny their own fallibility. The narcissistic parent may refuse to relate to the child under any other conditions. Life for the parent and child can feel like a delicate and fraught balancing act. The parent always having to insist on their perfection, the child always having to be convinced of their shameful supposed defectiveness. It's a balancing act because it's unrealistic, something purely psychological. The scapegoat child is not hopelessly flawed, nor the parent so superior. But this is the only version of a reality the narcissistic parent can tolerate. Today's video shows how the scapegoat child believes that their human fallibility makes them defective. This self-perception allows a narcissistic parent to deny their own imperfections. Now the scapegoat child has a painful way to stay connected to their parent. The scapegoat survivor can heal by applying the 3 pillars of recovery to know that they are valuable and fallible. Being fallible can live alongside being valuable. Well, my name is Jay Reed, and I'm a licensed psychotherapist in California, and I specialize in recovery from narcissistic abuse. In my professional and personal experience, I've worked to identify the fundamentals to this process of recovery. And this has led me to what I call the 3 pillars of recovery. Pillar number 1 involves making sense of what happened. Pillar number 2 is gaining distance, psychological, emotional, maybe physical, distance from narcissistic abusers and closeness with safe people. And pillar number 3 is living in defiance of the narcissist rules. It's also essential to find and participate in communities of people who can get, validate, and support you on this path. Today's video falls under pillar number 3, living in defiance of the narcissist rules. I've seen and experienced large improvements in quality of life after applying these 3 pillars. And if you want an in-depth guide for how to weave these pillars into your own life, you can check out my recently released book on Amazon. It's called Growing Up as the Scapegoat to a Narcissistic Parent, A Guide to Healing. And for a relatively low cost, you can understand this approach to recovery and see how it has worked in the many case examples throughout the book. There's also a more immersive guide to the 3 pillars via my online course called Recovery from Narcissistic Abuse. And I've organized all of these resources for recovery and more on my website. So if you go to the letter J, REID therapy.com, you can get access to free ebooks for survivors and therapists of survivors. You can get, there's a free webinar on self-care for survivors of narcissistic abuse, my blog, and a 3-hour course with accompanying CE credit for therapists of survivors of narcissistic abuse. Well, the scapegoat child's imperfections cancel out their strengths. A narcissistic parent worships at the church of perfection. Any sign of their own imperfection can result in intolerable states of worthlessness. And such parents may cope by seeing the scapegoat child as imperfect instead of themselves. This can turn abusive because being imperfect to the narcissistic parent means being worthless. The parent can set the child up to identify with these feelings of worthlessness. The scapegoat child has to adapt to a parent who cannot accept nor love themselves as they are. They cannot do this for the scapegoat child either. Instead, the parent limits their awareness to what they will accept, that is, being perfect. They cast out their imperfections onto the scapegoat child. The child has to live as an unacceptable person to the narcissistic parent. Painful as it is, it affords a reality to share with the parent. This is always better than being no one to a parent. The scapegoat child has to adopt the narcissistic parent's pathological calculus that to err is vile rather than human. Now, anytime the parent accuses the child of an error, the child feels worthless and even vile. By finding the scapegoat child as the imperfect and supposed vile one, the narcissistic parent gets to feel perfect in contrast. And this calculus goes unchallenged while the hot potato of imperfection is passed to the scapegoat child. And the child cannot pass the potato on to anyone else. It's as if the family closes the child's hands on that hot potato so that it scalds and remains with the scapegoat child and only that child. And I may be dating myself with this hot potato metaphor, but in the old days in elementary school, we'd play a game of hot potato where you throw something like a ball around to different classmates, and whenever music stopped, whoever was left holding the ball was left with the hot potato, and they had some sort of penalty. It's something we played at recess during rainy days, as I recall. But anyway, I digress. Let's look at another anonymized case example. We'll call him Roger. Roger recalled how excruciating family dinners were for him as an adolescent. The nightly ritual would be for his narcissistic parents and colluding sister to pick on his table manners. He would recall an uneasy tension between his parents at the start of dinner. His mother might gush over something that his sister did or said that day. Then that tense silence would return. And if Roger tried to chime in about his day, he was a second-class citizen. One night, he recalled saying, "Hey, I scored 2 touchdowns in football at recess today. It was awesome." And his father replied, "Hey, Roger, get your elbows off the table." Then his mother might pile on, "I don't know how you're going to function in life if you can't learn table manners. I hope you don't eat like that at school." And his sister would submit, "Well, he always chews with his mouth open, too." Roger felt the burning crestfall of shame at being rebuked in the moment he hoped to receive praise. He was furious. Something excruciatingly unfair seemed to be happening to him, but he had no recourse. They all seemed bonded together and as though they were inherently better than him. How could table manners make me so bad and them so good? He wondered to himself. It was no use, though. Such questions, perceptive as they were, had no good answers at this dinner table. Well, Roger's experience shows how a narcissistic family magnifies the scapegoat child's imperfections. His imperfect table manners, something most adolescents have not perfected, became cause for a systematic takedown of his character. Roger was treated like he was different than the rest of the family, worse than them, and deserved to be rebuked. In contrast, this left his narcissistic parents feeling flawless relative to him. What also got lost in these dinner table attacks was the display of confidence Roger had expressed. The fact that he had played really well in the recess football game went entirely ignored, as if what he did well was canceled out by his awful table manners. As this abusive treatment wore on, Roger stopped taking pride in what he did well. He had to adopt the identity of how his family was treating him, as someone who always ruined others' attempts to enjoy life by him being so defective. Whatever he did well in life was just a smokescreen to his real, vile nature. The scapegoat child's inner and outer worlds. The ways we relate to and are related to by our caregivers tend to stay with us. Psychoanalysts theorize that we carry internalized representations of ourselves and others based on such experiences. And I think a useful way to think about this is a self-other diagram. And these diagrams identify the self and the other, as it might seem. The self has a role to the other, as does the other to the self. And these roles happen at the conscious level and at the unconscious level. Next, an emotion characterizes the self's stance towards the other and the other's towards the self. Well, here's how this self-other diagram might look for the scapegoat child and their narcissistic parent. Okay, self and other representations for the scapegoat child. So first we have the scapegoat child's self and the narcissistic parent other. And this dividing line, it represents or splits the conscious versus the unconscious experience. Next, we have what is kept in the unconscious for the other, for the narcissistic parent. That's their own sense of being defective. That stays out of their conscious awareness. What is in their conscious awareness is a sense of being perfect. What can be only kept in the conscious awareness for the scapegoat child is their sense of being defective, And what has to go unconscious are their capabilities and their lovability. Meanwhile, the emotion that sort of connects the scapegoat child's self to the narcissistic parent other is a feeling of shame and inadequacy. That's how the child's self is positioned towards this parent as a result of how the parent treats the child. And what they receive from the parent is a sense of disgust and contempt from that parent, who is, again, relocating their own sense of defectiveness into the child, who must identify with it, and therefore gets to seem deserving of this parent's disgust and contempt. So the scapegoat child learns that their fallibility negates their value. I mean, none of us are perfect. The scapegoat child's imperfections do not get to live alongside their strengths. Imperfection negates the child's strengths and worth. The scapegoat child is saddled with the mandate to be perfect if they want to feel worth, while the family sees them as hopelessly imperfect. So it's a no-win situation. Just ask Roger in his experience at his childhood dinner table. The impacts on the scapegoat survivor. Well, this child adopts the belief that their imperfection makes them defective. Doing so cancels out their strengths. How can a defective person have good qualities? No matter how effective the child is, their imperfections seem to rob them of the credit they might otherwise deserve. I think denial of the truth is often something we do to avoid knowing something bad about ourselves. In the case of the scapegoat child, they must avoid knowing what is good about themselves. Either way, though, living at odds with the facts of one's existence creates a sense of dis-ease in our souls. So along with this baseline sense of dis-ease, the survivor can feel inadequate to others as a rule. The survivor's judgment is ill-informed compared to others. They are less responsible than others. They are not as intelligent as others. They fail more than others. And for the survivor, these conclusions get treated as facts. It may feel impossible to argue oneself out of these claims. And I want to make clear, those are kind of the conclusions drawn by the scapegoat survivor that kind of have to be insisted upon, not actual facts about who they are. Well, the path to healing the scapegoat survivor's belief that their imperfections make them defective is a non-linear one. If such a belief could be debunked in one fell swoop, I think it already would have happened. But the conditions under which this belief was forged, I think, need intervention. When this happens, the survivor can learn it is no longer necessary to equate imperfection with defectiveness. And here's where the 3 pillars to recovery come in. This approach heals by targeting the conditions that led to the survivor's painful belief in the first place. How the 3 pillars of recovery let you feel valuable and fallible. An important phase of recovery from narcissistic abuse is accepting oneself as is. The scapegoat survivor is unaccustomed to such acceptance. Here's how the 3 pillars of recovery help survivors break the link between fallibility and self-worth. The first pillar, making sense of what happened, can help survivors see through the ways they were treated. The survivor learns that a narcissistic person finds their own fallibility intolerable. Further, the narcissist will deny such feelings and relocate them into the scapegoat child. And that itself, though, is not enough. To more fully evacuate these feelings, the narcissist acts in ways to get the child to think about themselves as the worthless one. This is what happened to Roger at the dinner table. His parents trumped up an offense, putting his elbows on the table, that warranted, supposedly, their devaluation and derision towards him. He grew to think of himself as defective for having such terrible manners. As the scapegoat survivor learns about these pathological dynamics, they can question their conclusions about why they were treated this way growing up. While serving as the scapegoat, they had to believe they deserved to be treated so badly. Now they can look at it as a product of their parents' own psychological problems. And as the calculus of the fallibility equaling defectiveness falls away, a new reality can emerge. A narcissistic parent may have attacked you from the victim position. Your supposed offense is what is causing them to attack your character. It can be extremely confusing for the child. And this pillar of recovery arms the survivor with facts that such accusations were never true. The survivor may feel a relenting within themselves as they shed the burden of having to be perfect to have any worth. Reality can seem unfamiliar, even disorienting at first, when it's not organized by the premise that you are defective. But over time, this unfamiliarity can yield to a sense of freedom and compassion for oneself. The second pillar of recovery, gaining distance from the narcissistic abusers, creates safety. As I stated before in reference to the polyvagal theory, our nervous systems know when we are in danger. Being in close emotional and psychological proximity to a narcissistic abuser is dangerous. When in danger, our prefrontal lobes become less activated, and this is where thinking happens. And as a result, it's harder to learn new information. We are too focused on survival and act from our more primitive brain areas or the brain stem. And this is where the trauma responses are at the ready: fighting, fleeing, freezing, and submitting. Associating your own imperfection with defectiveness may help you avoid further danger with someone who is narcissistic. A narcissistic abuser will react with more intense coercion if the survivor does not comply. At the dinner table, Roger learned that if he asked why his parents did not pick on his sister for her manners, they would just ratchet up their attacks on him. If he told them they were being unfair, then they would accuse him of whining. This only made Roger feel ineffectually furious. As he stopped protesting, the bouts of attack would actually get shorter. Still painful, but somewhat less so. To learn that it is now safe to question whether imperfection means defectiveness, you need distance from the source of danger. It can be important to reframe distance as an act of self-care rather than punishment of anyone else. In fact, such distance can also be an act of protection for yourself, protection that was likely hard to come by as a scapegoat child. Distance protects the survivor from the dangers that would have ensued if they did not comply with this notion of being defective. The conditions can now be set where accepting oneself as fallible yet valuable is no longer a threat. There is no sort of hot potato of defectiveness that has to be held anymore. So it is a lot safer to consider otherwise. The third pillar of recovery, living in defiance of the narcissist's rules, can provide data that supports your value as a fallible person. Now, a scapegoat survivor can permit themselves to not be a perfect friend, a perfect partner, or perfect worker. And then what happens? Are they rejected or accepted when that happens? Or if they are with generally safe people, then acceptance will likely be the rule. This does not mean that you might not feel some anxiety or dread at defying this rule of never being imperfect. This rule has been too important for your survival to just be easily given up. But with repeated exposure to others' acceptance of your imperfections, that anxiety will decrease over time. The results. When these three pillars of recovery are put into practice, I think the scapegoat survivor has a new way to think about themselves and others. So now we can look at the possible self and other representations for the scapegoat survivor. Of course, we have the scapegoat survivor self, and now in this case, safe others. And we have the line that divides conscious and unconscious, but in this case, it's now kind of lower. There's a lot less that needs to be sort of stored in our unconscious because we're with safe others, and it's now permissible to be how one actually is, which is, as a human being, fallible. But that doesn't have to compromise one's sense of value. So here I put in what is kept in the unconscious is sort of things that need to be in the unconscious, like, say, death anxiety. If we went around constantly aware of the fact that we're all going to die at some point, that'd make it hard to function. So there are certain things that we need to kind of adaptively keep out of our awareness. What can be more conscious for these other people is that they are valuable and fallible, just as the scapegoat survivor self can kind of see themselves as. And again, they get to keep kind of these other facts about being human out of awareness in their unconscious instead of their gifts and capabilities like they had to in relation to the narcissistic parent. And then the feeling that is usually felt between the scapegoat survivor's self and these safe others can just plainly be one of love. And what they receive in response from the safe other is often pride, care, and compassion. In essence, these are kind of, there's a good feelings going back and forth. There's respect, mutual dignity, and reciprocity, and a recognition that no one's perfect, nor has to be perfect to warrant these reactions and these feelings towards one another. Well, I want to thank you for tuning in again this week. I hope you found today's video helpful in terms of understanding what had been the rules from kind of like knowing it's okay to be fallible, and why, as a scapegoat survivor, that may have been kind of intentionally forbidden from you getting to kind of live in that fashion, and how these 3 pillars of recovery can kind of arm you with tools and approaches to help free yourself to live in a way where you know you are valuable and fallible. Well, thank you again for your continued support of this channel. And it, again, is incredibly heartening each week to know that these videos have been helpful and useful to many of you. And as I mentioned a lot, I think the community that keeps developing around the videos and the support and validation offered to one another in the comments section is just also incredible to witness. And with that, I will look forward to posting again next Friday. Take care.